do that. Want to do that first, then we have one of the two other forestry issues I hadn't talked to you about yet, then we'll get to a number of others, and let's just try to plow through here. So I think we have till 10. So let me share my screen. Okay, can people see that okay? Just want to make sure I can see all of you still. So okay, so Charlie, you may want to just describe briefly. I just went ahead and accepted your red line to put in the slide. It didn't cover red line well, so I just kind of included this. You may want to describe what you did here, and then the second one on carbon offsets. So I'll kind of leave it to you to kind of walk people through these two. Charlie, you're on mute.
Before you jump in, Pat, can I ask a question, like logistical question? This is Sonia. I'm taking minutes as I've been doing. Are you taking the official notes on the discussions and what should be incorporated?
I'm like using the slide, so I'm making changes either like, you know, either yellow or green or whatever. So I'm taking notes kind of on this. They're not like perfect, but they're trying to capture where we come to in our discussions. So it's maybe a combination, Sonia, between the two of us, and I'll send out the slides right after.
Yeah, I can try. Yeah, I'm never sure how detailed, because I know the minutes are supposed to be more capturing, you know, the thrust of the conversation and not the specifics of the language changes, but I will attempt.
Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. All right, Charlie.
Thanks, Pat. So these three here are just three of the ones that dealt with kind of this idea of product replacement, trying to replace higher carbon footprint. Actually, it deals with a couple of things. The first one I'll just talk about is maybe starting with the second one here, the use of sustainably harvested, you know, wood-based construction materials to replace high carbon footprint ones like steel and concrete. So that one tried to clarify the language there, noting especially at the end that we need to research, you know, more research into the life cycle accounting for these products. The one kind of overall thing, I have been talking with folks from the Green Building Network over the past, you know, few days to try to get clarity on some of these and some additional recommendations. So I would offer just that under the strategy, if we can amend what's there to promote and incentivize the use of agricultural and wood products, adding agricultural to the strategy, because there are a number of kind of agricultural, whether it's agricultural residues or using things such as like sheep's wool for some types of building installation that are being used, which we don't want to kind of leave out of this picture. So if there's no problem there under strategy, I would just add agricultural.
Oh, it goes here. Sorry. Okay. Got you.
So if we could just amend that there, that would be great. So this middle one gets at kind of that building material substitution action. I do have a couple more specific ones that I can put in the chat if people are interested in terms of things that came right from the Green Building Network. The first one here is, so going back to the first action listed, this is just trying to kind of articulate better the proposed action around taking existing biomass energy plants to create greater efficiency, as well as try to create some more kind of heat power models. So for example, where there's existing biomass plants that could be used to use heat capture for district heating application, that would be great. And then it also kind of hits on the CHP, or the combined heat power models. So that's not just biomass when we think about Burlington Electric, it's biomass when we think about like Allard Lumber, who has created a system in there where they take actual sawmill residue from what they're generating, as well as supplementing with some other kind of biomass that they can get from harvesting, to then power the mill and then capture the heat there for part of their production process. So that is thinking both at kind of large scale and at small, you know, enterprise scale. And then the last one here is thinking more about what the state can do, that action around procurement standards for publicly funded buildings, looking to use sustainably harvested and certified products to do product replacement.
Charlie, there's a question in the chat about plastic or foam. Can you cover that briefly?
Can we add foam to the list of high embodied carbon materials? Oh, sure. Yeah, this was not meant to be like an exhaustive list of anything. So if we want to add, an example in here, no worries. Are you saying under the strategy or under like the action, like the second action here for that one?
Well, I just thought missing from a couple of them, and I feel like it's kind of important to point out in light of the push to insulate homes as one of our strategies, right? And from some of the other sectors, and so yeah, I know that there are some. What's that, Pat?
No, keep going. Sorry, I interrupted. Keep going.
No, that's it. I just think it's
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly other means that we can look at for energy efficiency. I guess the focus here was trying to think about ag and wood products and where they fit. But if we want to put in notes on using, spray foam and stuff, I don't know a whole lot about the kind of life cycle accounting of spray foam itself as far as kind of the carbon impacts there, but we can certainly add it.
great.
And then if it's okay, I just want to drop in the chat. These are a couple things that were offered from the Green Building Network that we could add to this. And I apologize, I just got these last night from two of the guys who are heading that up, along with Christine McGowan.
Oops, that didn't work. Let me try that again. All right, so people have any questions or concerns about the things in here or the things that Charlie's adding?
And I apologize again, this is a lot, but these four things here, one is very targeted at this kind of what looks to be like a growing potential market for using sheep's wool in insulation. And granted, we're not going to be like, it's not going to be an immediate massive market, but it is growing for use in this sector. The second one here gets at agricultural residue products for building materials, such as straw and hemp for building insulation. The regional certification standard for forestry to validate carbon storage values in forest products, I think is an important one to put in this strategy section, just to, again, ensure that we're getting these from well-managed forests, which I think is our intent, but if we can articulate that better, that would be great. And then the last one has to do with just enforcing a Vermont state energy code to reduce energy loads, so it's both kind of, what we're doing as far as building materials, but also codes and code enforcement.
So David, go ahead.
Just a quick reaction. This all seems good to me. I think we can consolidate and simplify.
Yeah.
I think I would suggest like a couple of these actions around the sheep wool products or the hemp and straw. I would leave out the specific products and just say, invest and promote product development of agricultural products and byproducts for use in building insulation and building materials. I think it could be that simple, and it would.
Yeah, we can totally clean it up to be more concise and shorter. I just wanted to put it all on the table for consideration first. And then just kind of more broadly, like one of the comments that the folks from this network did offer was that they really haven't seen a place that's clear to them in the work of the Climate Council where this kind of stuff would fit. So some of the stuff we might send up and maybe kind of rural resilience or cross-sector, it might get picked up elsewhere, but I do think it's important that we at least elevate it here, given that there's a direct tie-in to ag and wood products.
All right, Abby.
That was basically going to be my comment. Is I'm supportive of all of this, and particularly because of what I know about the growing nature of the fiber industry in Vermont. So my suggestion would be the same, that we flag these as potential. My guess is it would be cross-sector, the building component of cross-sector, where we might need to tie in some of these things, but I'm supportive of building out any actions that we can where we try to utilize, nose to tail, if you will, of the products that we're taking from our lands, and how we can best make those supply chains and the utilization really efficient. So thank you so much for all your legwork on this, Charlie.
Judy.
Yeah, happy to.
I know you mentioned about biomass, and you mentioned not just like Burlington's, but are you encouraging here additional businesses like McNeil?
So I think like, I guess the thought here, and again, I don't know if it's articulated clearly or how it'll play out, but the thought is we have existing large scale plants like McNeil and Reigate that need to be made much more efficient if we're going to keep using them, and need to be integrated more in like a systems thing, thinking about district heating, right? So larger plants, the idea is more kind of like, how do we make them more efficient and kind of get them better, for lack of a better phrase. The smaller scale kind of, when we think about biomass, more kind of the combined heat power models that I really see are more around things that are based in enterprises. So thinking about the Allard lumber example, but also some of the potential district heating models, for example, like right in Montpelier, you know, the kind of infrastructure that they've put in there. So opportunities there, I guess. So no, not implicitly saying we need like 6 more McNeil plants. Probably because that's just not going to happen realistically, but more kind of where can we harness this stuff in smaller scale ways that are more efficient.
Okay. Also, one of the big issues of McNeil when they were first permitted was they had this 100-mile circle, and they would only harvest from within the 100 miles. Well, they barely made it out the first year, and they still couldn't get what they needed. And so they started going out of state, and the first place they went was the contaminated areas in New York for emerald ash beetles.
Yeah.
And so should there be something in there about these places and where they harvest?
Yeah, so I think the procurement standard stuff that's listed under the strategy here is intended to get at that, though looking at the first action, I'm realizing that procurement standards are not articulated in that specific action. So we can certainly kind of, you know, as I think Pat's writing now, ensure, you know, appropriate procurement standards for XYZ. Because I agree, you know, that, you know, some of the ways they source wood doesn't make sense in terms of, you know, trucking distances, markets, what's available, you know, at a much closer range.
Right, because then it doesn't become, it becomes an issue of they're really not conserving because they're going so far away to get the biomass.
Jane, do you have a suggestion on language? And then maybe we're close to done just to keep us on time, but Judy raised a good point. So for Jane, any thoughts on language to add here?
I was just gonna say ensure and maybe enforce, to Judy's point, you know, that sometimes we don't, I know she's brought that up before, that we don't, you know, follow through on making sure that the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So maybe that's just a word to add in there.
Right. Done. Whoops. Oh, okay, there we go. All right. Billy, anything else? Bill, you're on mute somehow.
Can you hear me?
Yep, now we can hear you.
All right. I think we need to be explicit about what we mean about procurement standards in this context. There's a whole range of things that fall into that, some of which I don't support, some of which are very controversial and reach deep into management practices. So if we're talking about like distance of woodshed and things like that, that's fine, and we can speak to those, but that's a loaded term, and if we're not clear what we mean there, it can be misinterpreted.
But Billy, give me language.
Well, I'm just trying to be responsive to what people raise. So I think, you know, radius of woodshed.
I mean,
go ahead, Charles.
I completely agree with you, Billy. And so flagging that, could the recommendation be more that we, you know, strongly recommend a rigorous process of developing procurement standards? I mean, kind of just flag it as something we really need to address, but maybe not try to solve it here.
Sure.
Because if we start calling out specific things as opposed to other specific things, you know,
Right. Like I know that, we just adopted rules for what constitutes a renewable wood fuel source for tier 2 RES compliant generators. And it's basically procuring wood consistent with current use standards and AMPs or a comparable plan. That doesn't get into the distance issue. That's more around like the harvesting standard, but sure.
Judy, go ahead and let's try to wrap this up and move on. Judy, go ahead.
But Billy, that doesn't really, A&R doesn't have the teeth to enforce that, do they?
Well, we certainly enforce the current use program. We monitor and enforce current use, and this is that standard is for compliance with the Renewable Energy Standard Program, and that's enforced by the utilities and the Public Utility Commission.
So I think rather than try to sort, I think we have the language that's close enough. I don't think we can solve all the details because it's complicated, but if we have that in there, I think it's the point, because Judy raised a good point, and then details obviously to be worked out. So I add the word development and left enforcement in there too. Okay, so I'm going to move us on if that's okay. Let me save this. And the next one was around offsets, and we had a rigorous discussion last time. So I think, Charlie, you want to explain kind of some of the language you worked on here?
So the tweaks to language here, I think, just tried to address some of the conversation last time. So that's just the only changes, really, just to kind of say that, we are looking at these kind of more market-based solutions, but flagging that, there are things that need to be addressed as far as efficiency, impacts, leakage, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully this kind of addresses that.
And Charlie, I snuck in some language to equity and and I added in how small lot owners may benefit as well. So we don't lose track of at least the partial scale issue, whether that's appropriate, I don't know.
Yeah, you could certainly just say, yeah, and address issues of equity among, the diversity of forest landowners in the state.
Oh, Billy, comment on this one?
I think it's great. Oh, sorry, that's an old hand. Apologies.
Other questions about this one?
Alyssa just wrote in the chat, should we recommend research on some of the pieces we don't fully understand here?
Yeah, and I think that's the intent here around, which address concerns around efficiencies of baseline establishment, impacts of additionality. So that's kind of the idea there, that in developing these programs, we need to, come up with a way that addresses those questions.
I'm just add research in here.
I mean, I think there's been a lot of research and review of kind of existing programs that exist, nationally, things that are based kind of in California markets. So I think we know what a lot of the problems are. I think our job is to, flagging those problems, now develop systems that address them.
All right. Anything else on these for now? Jake.
Yeah, I think just edit is I think the impacts of additionality. I wonder though about that word choice too. I'm just looking at it like accounting of additionality.
Ensuring additionality.
Yeah, because it's really about the determination of if it is additional.
Yeah, accounting totally works. Yep.
Accounting for, accounting of, what's the?
Accounting for additionality would be a fine way to phrase it.
Jake, does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Okay.
And Pat, Ali put in the chat that there's no E in Reggie.
There's no I in team. There's no E in Reggie. Okay, sorry. Morning humor. Okay. Okay, Charlie, the next one was one we haven't talked about. So, but this was one that came up in a number of ways. And I know this is really hard to read. I know I'm trying to make it slightly bigger.
Yeah, and I'm glad we're flagging this one too, because the topic of kind of old forests, passive management, and the impacts of UVA have come up a lot in the stakeholder meetings. So I think this is a good one to talk about today, especially because of that.
So there's a bunch of comments around conserve, protect old forest number 65. You should look off to the right if you can read the tiny script. There's the state policy of no forest lost, which had some conversation, and then there's support efforts to allow for passively managed. And so I think look at these comments, and I don't know quite what to do with them, but take a minute to look at this and let's talk about how to proceed. There's also one at the bottom about climate friendly practices, but let's do that one last because it's a little bit different issue. There is, I'm highlighting some area where people had suggested some language. I'm going to just bold this because it's suggested language changes.
I think one thing here that's a little bit tricky is that there was some other things that might not have had comments embedded in this thread that have a bearing on this. I think, like, for example, there was a one about existing UVA frameworks around ecologically significant treatment areas as a potential means to get at some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a challenge. There's a lot of similar actions, and these are just the ones that people had comments on. There's others that might assume these actions that didn't have comments.
Yeah, so specifically the one about supporting efforts to allow passively managed forest land enrollment in UVA, because there's multiple tracks out there around this, and that they're not all the same, but they all try to get at kind of, I think, the same end state. And so I think, like, generally there's, one track to kind of support and allow for passively managed forest land would be to do it within the existing framework of ecologically significant treatment areas, but acknowledging that there's work that has to be done to bridge the gap between the ability to enroll old forests versus the ability to manage forests to get to that state. If we can't manage them to be old forests, how are we ever going to get more old forests to enroll? And I know that FPR is doing some work on that now. I don't think that their plan is kind of fully prime time yet, but that's one track. Another track would be to simply open up a new category that would allow for any land to be entered into a passive management category. And then kind of a sub track under that would be to allow for lands to be entered into the program in a passively managed category, but only under the conditions of a permanent conservation easement. The idea being that if we're going to allow passively managed forests to be enrolled for the purpose of achieving old forest conditions, then the intent there would be that they need to be old forest forever, and so they would be conserved. I know there's multiple working groups in the state, both public and private, talking about this.
David, you had a comment?
I have a process question for the group. Patrick, you can help us, maybe give us some advice. But if we dip our toe in current use, we're dipping our toe into a vortex. It's not like a simple, let's go this path or that path, which, we haven't resolved even the question of, do we want to reopen current use? I think, we should, as a group, decide, do we want to suggest opening current use to consider ways to incentivize a different balance of forest management practices, including the potential for passive management, or not? And then once we cross that threshold, I think we should stop, because honestly, and we should recommend something along the lines of explore, develop, work on, with some directionality in terms of, we want to incentivize, an increase in the carbon storage capacity of our forests, along with all the other values through current use incentives. But once we get into the details, as Charlie's mentioned, there's lots of work groups. You know, and as the public discussion that we've had for the last 2 days illustrated, there's lots of very different views around it. I think frankly, it's enough for us to say we think we should open up current use and we should encourage it as an incentive to use, you know, different balance of force management practices, and then stop. Because I don't think this group has, I don't feel that I have the expertise to be involved in this in a way without creating unintentional repercussions, because we're tinkering with a whole set of an intermingling of property tax, landowner behaviors, as well as the complexity of carbon and forest.
Billy, then Charlie.
I just put something in chat. I tend to agree with David. One thought may be, you know, we had previously discussed to try to use Vermont Conservation Design's age class goals for kind of old and young forest as a metric, since that's exists and was developed with good science. It's not purely focused on carbon, but it's focused on biodiversity and the range of benefits forests provide. So we may say something as simple as enable use value to serve as one of several tools to achieve VCD's age class goals, and then just kind of leave it at that. But that might even be going too far given David's statements.
Billy, I would support that, because I do think giving some directionality is important. It's just getting into the weeds of trying to define, you know, like the point that Charlie made is a valid one, that we need to think there are arguments from, I think, some really thoughtful forest experts that I know that talk about the need to be engaged in some level of management in order to encourage old growth characteristics. On the other hand, there are others who argue pretty strongly that the best way to get to old growth is to stand back and let it grow for the next 500 years. And that presents very different worldviews that I don't think we're going to reconcile here.
A question, Charlie, go ahead. And then and I have a question for Charlie. Charlie, go ahead.
I totally agree with incorporating kind of the VCD targets in the conversation around this. One kind of tricky spot there is that I think it's nothing simple, right? But it's a little simpler to say we can meet our old forest targets of X%, because that's really kind of just saying passive management. The age class targets are much more kind of nuanced and funky, because then you're looking at, you know, 80% of the forest land is in private ownership, and how do you do that on private lands in a way that makes any sense or can be achieved? So I kind of would back a little bit from kind of putting that there.
That's fine. Feel free to take that out. I just threw that out as a
but I think
suggestion.
broadly saying that using Vermont Conservation Design as a template, especially around the old forest one, that, you know, getting to just back to the idea of the passively managed forest enrollment, we could certainly leave it as just kind of this bigger statement of allowing for passively managed forests to be enrolled, which could be fine. My only concern there is that's a big statement without any nuance to it, which can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And my personal, again, this is my personal thought here, is that if we want to move the ball on this, I see what's been talked about and the structure developing around using the existing framework within UVA and ESTAs to kind of push this and get more old forests enrolled as being, frankly, much more politically feasible. And if we're going to try to move something forward, I guess I would rather be explicit in a way that supports something that is more politically viable than trying to push something that's not. I mean, if we just say we want to have passive forests enrolled in UVA, that's never going to get across Governor Scott's desk. And he's there for another year. And if we want to see movement on this in a relatively short time frame, I think we can do more good through the other language. And that's the reason why, I personally have been looking towards using existing frameworks and tweaking them as opposed to doing more wholesale changes, which I just think, well, they're good outcomes, the ends we want to get to. I just don't see them moving anytime soon.
So let me,
I support Charlie's recommendation.
And I want to come back to specifically what it's doing. I think there's a lot of stuff going on here, so I'll figure out how to get this clear. But David, go ahead, and I want to just check in on a few things.
I want to react because to Charlie's point about what's politically feasible, because I think it goes to, it's not just current use, it goes to all of our recommendations. And I think if we were trying to work out a strategy for a coalition to put forward a legislative proposal to go forward this session, I would agree. But that's not what we're doing. We're building a 30-year plan for what the state should be working towards. And I think it should be more visionary and kind of a larger picture. And frankly, I think ultimately this plan will be part of changing the politics around these issues. So I advocate for being, I'm not actually disagreeing, Charlie, with your suggestion, as much as I'm disagreeing with kind of the premise of the reason for it, if that makes sense. I think we should be more aspirational in what we recommend, not unmoored from reality, but aspirational, and not think about the current pragmatic issues of politics.
Yeah, and I think we should dream big, David. I guess I also think that we should need to be kind of as articulate as possible about what we mean. And so how do we meet in the middle, right? You know.
So here's a question. So Jake put some language from CLF in their comments that I've bolded here. This, like, to meet Vermont Conservation Design 3030 targets, permanently conserve, passively restore at least 15%, et cetera, et cetera. This one right here. I don't know what people think about that language, but Jake raised it, so I just wanted people to talk about that briefly. And I think as a next step, rather than me trying to figure this out, we're gonna have to figure out someone's gonna take this and clean it up, because I don't think it's me. But what do you think about the language Jake put in the chat there that I bolded right there?
I think the nut of it, using Vermont Conservation Design to basically direct our targets for old forests, is spot on. And I think we have it in here somewhere, but definitely highlight it.
These are two separate conversations. This is talking about permanent conservation versus we're talking about the use value appraisal program, which is a different tool that focuses on kind of management practices. So I think this is a fine, I don't disagree with this statement. I just don't know that this solves the thing we're talking about right now.
Yeah, just to be clear, I posted this in relation to sort of 65 because of the vague language that was there, and maybe, you know, now the conversation has turned to 65 and 72 are kind of, we're trying to merge those things together, or if we're keeping them separate, you know, that more specific language that CLF did provide in their comments might be viable for us to still kind of put forward.
So I wonder, only because of time and also some mishmash here, and I obviously don't understand forest well. I wonder if given the conversation we have, anything, other comments people make, and then someone kind of take this and kind of clean up these parts of the matrix, because I think someone can probably do that better doing a little thinking from today's conversation versus me trying in real time. So I wonder if, Charlie, I don't know if you're the guy. I also know you have an important event this week, so you may not have time. So I wonder, how do we kind of proceed to kind of clean this up and address some of the points people just made?
I mean, I can try to take a stab at it again today and circulate it right back out after the meeting if that works. And I do think to Jake's comment, 65 does not have to do, we don't have to keep line 65 specific to current use. You know, we can, you know, think bigger there, and addressing that fact that if we want, you know, old forest conservation, the actual permanent conservation, which is really important, is going to be outside of current use. And also much more nuanced.
Right, like 66 talks specifically to UVA and Estes and old forest. So I think there's already strategies in the spreadsheet. They're just not on this page.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, and David noted about 30 by 30, there aren't targets, at least not yet. So I think just note that potentially we may have to clean up that language. And I can just get rid of the targets. So I think if people are okay, Charlie, like you did with the other two, will take all of this mishmash, including some stuff I didn't even put in here. I have one other topic I want to talk about on this, but then Charlie will kind of maybe, just like you did before, Charlie, do you mind sending out like just a nice clean Word version? And we can
yeah, I can try to combine this with the other ones that weren't flagged to make it kind of a more concise 4 or 5 action thing and get that back out to everybody.
That's great. Thank you. That'd be much
Thank
appreciated. There is one last one here, which is there was a lot about support new state tax policy incentives for forest landowners and farmers to adopt climate-friendly practices, such as create a tier within UVA. And there's a lot of skepticism that that was doable. So I wonder whether we just need to not mention the specific UVA piece, or we want to just strike 89 altogether, because that one felt a little different.
Yeah, I think I might have been the one that recommended removing that just because tax policy incentives typically are through current use. And I like, I don't know, that's a sort of such a nuanced thing. And within current use already, it's already hard to, establish. I think about the cut contrary process and how hard it is for the state to even enforce that in some cases. Like, again, the application of this would be difficult.
Does anybody feel strongly about leaving 80 in, or can we strike 80?
Patrick, I don't feel strongly about leaving it in, but I do, it's a question more than a comment. There was some really compelling commentary I heard from a number of landowners that resonated with me about wanting to manage their forests in ways that were good for climate and carbon, but not knowing what that looked like. And I know that for many forest landowners, the forest management plans that their forester comes up with as part of the current use program is one of the main ways that they make decisions about how to manage their forest. So I do think I'm hopeful that somewhere in here we've got captured the idea that we want state foresters and the state to be providing clear guidance about what the best climate forest management practices are.
I think we do have that elsewhere, David. And I think as Billy put out, promoting the carbon friendly management practices, I think we have that captured elsewhere. So I think we do get to that.
So I think what we're going to do is we're going to strike this specific language around the tax incentives, but we're going to have, but 90 captures the broader point you just raised, David. I think already captures it, as Billy put in chat. Jake?
Yeah, I'm curious, Charlie, if or if maybe this notion is captured somewhere else, of kind of more in the vein of exploring that type of incentive, like, because I think support is kind of in general like a very non-directional term, or kind of a passive notion of how to go about it. So I just kind of it sounds like, Charlie, you're kind of getting to the feasibility of implementation, which is something that maybe needs further investigation. Because I mean, personally, I do feel like exploring kind of tiered incentives and using existing policy mechanisms is a good approach, but certainly acknowledging that there might be real issues of feasibility around doing that.
And I could imagine to number 90, you could add and explore, so on and so forth. I think it'd just be folded into maybe 90 as just another tool potentially. So,
right.
Ryan.
I missed it. Did we discuss number 71?
I don't know if we have enough or not, so go for it. If you have a comment, Ryan, go for it.
Well, I guess I'm confused about what's going to be cleaned up. Are these going to be all swept together in broad categories of, explore existing programs and policy mechanisms, and the intent of these actions will all fall under that heading, in which case, sure, that's great. And I think that we need to acknowledge that recommendations to elevate may take time out after climate action plan is published for either this body or others to work to develop and implement recommendations to continue to inform those, because I think there's significant discussion around no forest loss or no net forest loss that I don't think we've touched on, because there's obviously impacts for agriculture and developed land, and where is that going to be centered. So if a number of these are going to be rolled up into other categories, definitely support that. Otherwise, I want to spend some time talking about that one. So this is more of a process question around that point. Thanks.
Yep. So I'm not sure, Charlie, if you had thoughts about if you had any thoughts about what you're going to do with that one, and then we'll come back to David and Judy.
Specifically around 71.
Yeah.
No, I was just curious what folks thought about no forest loss versus net loss versus gain, and I'm happy with any of them, to be honest. To the bigger point, I think what's developing here is that we've got kind of the coalescing of the strategies around kind of targets, management things, policy and programs that we can roll together, and then acknowledging kind of this idea of exploring, to Jake's point, like, I think keeping it as explore new tax policy incentives for landowners is certainly fine to put in there. I think that kind of better addresses this idea that there's a lot of unknowns around it. And so before we jump into just implementing, trying to figure out how those things would work.
David and Judy.
Two points. I'll try to be concise, but I think first of all, to Ryan's point, we should have an ag and ecosystems recommendation that we want no net loss of both agricultural and forest land. Both of those are things that we don't want to see. And then we don't want to see one played off against the other, where we're necessarily pressuring, we're creating state policy that encourages more land clearing for agriculture, just for the sake of creating more agricultural land, and vice versa. We don't want policies that somehow encourage the conversion of agricultural land to forest, just to create forests. Like we want both. But what the common enemy is the permanent conversion to development. So I would love to see language that captured both. And then on the kind of more detailed question of net gain, no net loss, it should clearly be net. There's there's no possible way under the Constitution to lock current land uses in permanently on private lands. But I do think, so net is important. And frankly, I aspire to, that we think in some ways about net gain. And we think about it in the context of healthy forests and healthy ag land, that we want to encourage the expansion of land that are in that status. But I would accept no net loss of ag land and forest land as a compromise and as an important statement for the state of Vermont and for our subcommittee.
Great. Judy, then I'll come back to Marley's point. Judy?
I have a question about the process. We seem to skip numbers like 65, 71, 72, 89. How was it decided which ones we would address, and were everybody's comments placed into these?
Judy, this is totally on me. So what I did to try to get our conversation focused over the last few days was pull up the ones that seem to have mini comments or contradictory comments, and not necessarily detailed comments about slight wording changes or this thing, needs to be folded into that thing. So this was me just pulling out what looked like the more meaty topics for discussion, just because going through the entire matrix one by one, we would never get done. So that's solely on me for sure.
And that's your position, to decide which ones are more important than others?
Well,
Only
Judy,
the-
this is Marley. If I could add to that, I'm the one who took everyone's comments and put them into one spreadsheet. And I took all of your narrative comments, Judy, from your Word document. And all of those were included in the major spreadsheet that went out to everyone last week. What Pat may have pulled here, I suspect, is a summary of that, because anywhere where there were questions or contention on subjects, they were flagged in that spreadsheet. None of your comments were lost, Judy. And I absolutely encourage people to go back to that original spreadsheet, not the original, the one that I sent out last week that has everybody's comments summarized, which Pat or I could resend again, and make sure that anything that you put in there is being flagged here if you feel strongly about it.
Thank you, but that wasn't my question. My question was, Pat,
Yes.
is that your role to decide which ones should be discussed and which ones shouldn't?
I think my role is to help you all focus and get the job done. It's not to decide. And this was an effort to help you focus, not to exclude anything or anybody or any issue. So that was my best effort to do so.
So then all of the comments will be turned in.
So that's a good question. So the comments that Marley pulled together, which is everything in one place, we need to think about what you all wanted. We need to talk about how we go from today and to a spreadsheet that essentially the Vermont Climate Council is asking for. And if you guys want to include all those comments on the side as you submit it, that's really up to you all.
Well, I don't want them to be lost. I mean, I realize they're all on a spreadsheet someplace, but if we don't turn them in, what the hell good was all our discussion about them for?
Well, and the hope is to actually here's my understanding, Judy, and Coach, tell me if I'm wrong, was that those comments were individually assembled by Marley for us then to have the discussion to see if we can resolve issues, and then forward to the Climate Council, essentially quote unquote a clean matrix. But it may be better to leave some of those comments into the side so that the council is aware of the ongoing kind of discussion and issues that people have raised. And that's really all up to you.
Well, it just seems flawed to have you select which ones you believe is important to discuss.
So Judy, I certainly, if the group wants me to take a step back and we can go back to the full matrix, we can do that. That's really, I work for you all. So I'm going to defer to you and the co-chair from this point forward about how to proceed.
Just to step in, I think the goal with Pat's exercise was to tee up the ones that had the most comments, the most confusion and discussion about them, so we could focus on them now.
That's my point, Billy.
Right, but then let
How
me
does
finish.
he decide which ones are most important?
Because they had the most comments from a broad range of subcommittee members. But let me finish. Then my hope is that we go back to the full spreadsheet after we've resolved these that have the highest volume of comments and see where we stand. Hopefully we can do that on Friday and come up with a final sheet. But these were the ones that seemed to generate the most response. So I think that's why we framed them up for today's conversation.
I don't know if there were other hands up with Ryan and David.
Sorry, that's a vestige. I'll take it down.
Okay,
But I'm not,
Happy, go ahead.
I'm not sure that we're answering Judy's question and I don't want her to feel pushed off in this regard. So I think what we're saying is, Judy, I know that your comments are in the matrix because I've read them there. I'm not sure how many of them made it into these slides. If I'm understanding Billy right and the way that we're trying to approach this right, I think that the rest of those comments can come up on Friday. Is that a fair?
Sure. I think we have to get through the whole thing by Friday. And, at that point, we'll be looking presumably line by line at everyone's, at all the residual comments. I think these were the ones that seem to need the most initial focus, is my sense.
So Judy, too, I know that there in some later slides, there are a number of issues you raised that I know you slides that we haven't got to yet. Whether I got all of your comments around these forest issues, either I don't. And again, I work for you all. So if I'm not helping, so Judy, I want to kind of turn to you about how you want to, what you would prefer to.
Well, I see all this discussion and I had added comments about non-timber forest products and I don't see one spot where you talked about non-timber forest products.
And I think there was not, I'm gonna have to go back and remember, but if I remember right, there wasn't any controversy about those comments. No one contradicted them or said otherwise. I think it's a matter of
if there's not any controversy, that doesn't mean you can exclude it.
No, it means it should be included, correct? It should be included in the final matrix. I think that, and so what I was trying to address is stuff that where people seem to either say take it out or there was a disagreement or the like. The things essentially people said add this or do this, and there was no further comment. I took that as something someone's going to have to add in as we finish up the matrix for this week. Abby, go ahead.
That's what I was going to clarify. So I think, Judy, a lot of the comments that you made, nobody said anything contradicting them, and therefore they now live in the action steps and will be added in. So in other words, your comments were accepted. So your suggestions about incorporating the non-timber forest products, et cetera, is now a component of the list of actions. Not that it was taken out, just that nobody had an argument with it. So it will be rolled into our actions moving forward as a suggestion.
Okay,
as a recommendation.
That's what I was trying to understand. I don't believe that was explained to us as part of the process.
So I think, Judy, you raised an important point. So I think let's talk about who, but somebody's going to go back through Marley's kind of version of all the comments rolled up. And for the things that we didn't talk about that people suggested adding or modifying or lumping, someone's definitely got to do that cleanup, and it's not me. So I think let's stop I know David, you have to go in a second. You wanted to raise a question about river corridors. So could we do a quick flip flop? David would give you 2 minutes to raise something about river corridors. Go back to Judy's point about process. So
Patrick, yeah, and I apologize to everyone that I have to duck off. I've got so many things I'm juggling right now. I know you all are, but I'm not actually sure if there's controversy over this or not. I know in the broader world there is. So I wanted to speak to that, which is the question of, do we need better statewide protections for our floodplains and river corridors? It's been a long time political football. There's been, past buffer bills and various efforts to connect and protect various components of our floodplains and river corridors. ANR and the state of Vermont, frankly, is a international leader in the recognition of the kind of river dynamics and physics around those. And we have shied away as a state from regulating, because once you step into that space, half of the state was built in floodplains and river corridors in terms of our settled areas. So it's not an easy topic, and it raises questions of local land use control, as do a lot of the topics that we've been talking about. But I wanted to flag it as a central issue for us as an Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, both in the sense that it's one of the greatest opportunities for removing or addressing development patterns that are incompatible with healthy floodplains and river corridors, and by planting trees and building up woody plant debris, all the healthy soils, all the carbon that's stored in healthy floodplains. So there's both a carbon element to doing a better job of managing our river corridors and floodplains. And there's also a huge equity and human and community dimension to it, in that we have so much of our housing and so much of the people who live in harm's way are at most at risk, that are economically disadvantaged or traditionally underrepresented in a lot of our decisions. And so it's a big topic, but I wanted to flag that I really believe we should have a strong recommendation that there be, if it has to be more general at the level of, we need to do some state planning, and it fits into a broader land use pattern discussion like the rural zones community, subcommittee is talking about. But I just see such a strong tie to our work in this area. And I wasn't on this task group that was working on this. I just wanted to kind of speak to that as an important issue, I'm hoping not one that we kind of just breeze by because it's controversial, or maybe not even politically feasible right now, but someday maybe. So thanks, Patrick, for the chance to get on my soapbox for a second.
You bet. And that issue is coming up in slide some other down the road here just a little bit too, but glad you got it in before you had to go. So Judy, back to your point. So the process question is, we do need someone to clean up the points from today's discussion. For instance, Charlie's going to do that section, but we also need someone to go back to the spreadsheet and address all the less controversial, in so much as I got that right, issues to fold into the spreadsheet. So the question is that something we state staff, we're going to try to do that. Marley, you really dove into the spreadsheet itself. Do you feel like, you with help from Judson and Bob can do that? Do you feel like you need help from some of the members here to get that done by Friday?
I don't think that's the task, right? Like, everyone had the opportunity to review the full suite, to provide comments, to raise questions and disagreements. I don't think we should put it on Marley and Judson to resolve those disagreements. I think if, after we get through our work today, we can put the spreadsheet back out, resolving as many things as we can through the past two meetings. There's still going to be residual comments in that list of 150 items. And I think it's on this group to resolve those, right? I think that's what Judy's asking for, to make sure that everyone's comments get consideration. And I just don't think it doesn't seem appropriate to try to put it on staff to kind of make those decisions. I don't know that we're going to have the time Friday to do that, but I think that is kind of generally what we have to do. It's the task assigned to us, and the process we all established, and be interested in Abby's thoughts on that. But I think that's kind of where we're at.
Abby?
Yes. I agree with that. And I think Alyssa's comment in the chat is what I would agree with that as well, that any unresolved comments or anything that we haven't brought forward in these slides needs to be retained in the final version and then talked about on Friday.
So
And this isn't going to be I think we're giving the council as much as we can this week. And I think if we have unresolved issues, we're still going to need to go through a prioritization, equity screening. There's still a lot of work we're going to need to do to this list. So if there's still unresolved issues, we can spend time on those after Friday as needed. But I think we should work as hard as we can to resolve as many comments as we can prior to sitting this to the council.
And a thought then is what we would have is, and Marla, I don't check with you because you've been kind of piecing this together. We've got pathways, strategies, actions, and then notes. And so what everybody will see on Friday is essentially a cleaned up version with the notes off to the side as noted by Judy and others. And then in so much as we want to address some of those Friday morning to finish them off, we can. And in so much as we can't, we leave them in. Does that sound like a good process?
It's fine with me.
And Sonia's trying something in chat. Jane, I'll go to you while I read Sonia's comment in chat. So Jane, over to you.
Yeah, I just thought I'd suggest that rural resilience and adaptation, they, and Marion can speak to this better than me as well, but she's been supporting them really closely in this, but they do not have consensus on all of their actions that they are lifting up to the council. And they felt like the way that they dealt with that is at this point in time, they all felt comfortable with continuing to work on the actions that were elevated, being that none were being, the ones that where they didn't have resolved conflicts that should be elevated and then considered as we move through prioritization in the next 2 weeks. And so I just want to say that there's precedence for putting forward a larger suite of actions perhaps than what will be included in your final package later in October.
So Judy, I want to turn back to you to see if that you raised an important issue about where all this is and will end up. So if the kind of approach that we've talked about, cleaning up the spreadsheet, keeping all the comments, talking about when ones people want to on Friday, and then the spreadsheet will include any sort of outstanding issues, comments we didn't discuss will just remain in the spreadsheet that's submitted. Is that okay for you? Judy, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I'm focused on Sonia's note in the chat. And maybe it's the same thing that you're saying. Are you saying that that unresolved comments will be held in the final version as a note?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm not in agreement with that.
Good. So give us something that would work better for you.
That we come to consensus about it and then put it in the way it should be.
I think that's what our plan is. Ultimately, we have a deadline to provide something to the council this Friday. So I think what we're talking about is in what we provide, acknowledging that there are still unresolved items that we're going to continue to work on, but including them, those unresolved items and what we provide to the council, and then continuing to do this work after Friday to get to consensus on what's ultimately our final suite of recommendations. We just don't, I'm not confident we'll be able to do that by the end of this week.
I understand what you're saying, Billy, but I've been squawking about this time issue since day one. And I just think that I'm not in a position to trust right now that they'll be included down the road, because time will always be pushed to the forefront. We don't have time. We don't have time. In the interest of time, let's move forward. I'm not willing to trust that that will happen.
So here's one or two thoughts. One thing is if people are willing and able, we could try to find more time Friday morning than the 10 to 12 we have. So that's one question. And then if we can get the matrix cleaned up with everything still in it out, then what we can do is prioritize those items on Friday that in particular, if someone feels need to be discussed in the matrix in a clearer way than just a note, Judy, to your point. So we may be able to capture everything, but if X, Y, or Z is important to any of you, we will focus in on those things on Friday we haven't talked about today. Ryan?
Yeah, on process, wanted to share that I think, we found consensus at the pathway level. I think we mostly have it at the strategy level. I hear from this group, we want to tackle the charge before us in the Global Warming Solutions Act with real intention and give meat to recommendations. But I think we also have to acknowledge the limitations of our time, and absent the ability to come to full consensus, actions which center goals but outline a research process or the continuation of this subcommittee or other jurisdictional bodies to research, develop, and implement those strategies up until or working towards the next amendment of the climate action plan might be a reasonable place to end up Friday. So not trying to discount the important conversations we're having, but I think we have some high level directional agreement, and I don't want the specifics to, they're important, but I think we need time to dig into those. And I think that's what a recommendation could look like for an action, is to dig into and build those recommendations either for the next climate action plan amendment or for future implementation by the Climate Council or other jurisdictional bodies.
Judy, thanks, Ryan. A process question I'll list up in the chat. So Judy, I don't know if you feel up for this or not, but one thing we can do is really make sure, in particular, that on Friday we, when you see the cleanup matrix, we focus in on those things that you most want to talk about in particular, whether it's non-timber products or any number of other things.
I'd be happy to do that, but I'm not sure I have additional time between now and Friday.
I mean, one thing, Marley, maybe state staff could do is because Marley, where comments came from because you assembled it, whether we actually pull out particularly some of the comments that weren't addressed somehow in these conversations and make sure we get to those early on Friday. So Judy, then you wouldn't necessarily have to do it because we already have your comments already. And Marley, I don't know if you feel like that's doable.
Pat, I think it would be very difficult for me to go through all of the comments in the spreadsheet that I created and say which ones have not been addressed. I wasn't part of the meeting the other day on Friday because I couldn't attend it. And I don't want that responsibility, back to what Billy said as well. And in addition, I cut and pasted comments. I did not keep track of who said what where. The only distinction is that Judy's were in a narrative document instead of a spreadsheet, and so I could go back and find those more easily. But I'm afraid that would be very difficult. I really think it's more fair, unfortunately, to ask that people go back to that spreadsheet and just or to their comments and see what has not been discussed yet that they feel strongly about. I'm happy to do whatever I can as staff, but I don't know that that's possible.
Okay, so let's do this because I'm aware of time.
So Patrick, I'm not trying to be obstinate here. I just, Brian said that we all agreed on everything. I don't recall that we all had consensus on this. I don't recall even discussing this format that we're using now I do recall being told everybody's comments would be included. I do recall that. Now, I may be mistaken. I may have missed a meeting. I don't know, but I don't recall coming to consensus on this process.
Sorry, Judy, I was referring to the pathways that were elevated.
I don't recall
to
coming to
the
consensus
Climate
on those either.
Council,
So let's do this.
2 months ago.
Let's do this for timing wise. Co-chairs, I think Judy's raised important process considerations for how we wrap this up. I'd like to kind of get us back focused on what and actually there's some topics coming up, Judy, that you did raise. I want to make sure we get to. So I wonder if we could come back to like diving into some of the substantive conversation, the process issue fairly noted, and then co-chairs, maybe we need to figure out on Friday how to manage Friday to address some of the concerns Judy raised, as well as think about what product we submit, to the Climate Council. But I'm wondering if this kind of goes back to the co-chairs on a process question before Friday, rather than try to resolve it right now, because I think we're running out of time. Abby.
Well, the first thing, Judy, I do know your comments are in the complete document. These slides aren't the complete document. And some of your comments, I believe, are on subsequent slides. So I do just want to say that too, that I checked to make sure that your comments were in the matrix, and they are there. I process wise, I don't know. I'm a little bit at a loss. I've been raising, we're on the same, we've had concerns about time, we have concerns about process. I don't really know where we go with this at this point, but I don't want our people, you know, everybody who's given so much time and energy to this to feel bad about the process. I also am not sure how to get around that, given the fact that we don't have enough time to do any of this in a manner that's good process. And that's not on any of the people here. So I don't know.
So why don't we do this if we could? It's 9:12 now, Judy, if this is okay with you and others, is we kind of try to get through a few more of these slides. Charlie's kind of agreed to try to clean up as best he can this forest lands issue 1, recognizing the no net loss of ag and forest land is something we probably still need to talk about, but I want to get to a few other issues why we can. And then about 10 of 10, we'll kind of come back to this question of how we make sure that people feel like it's thorough and that everything that was offered is included and handled in the appropriate way, which will be partly a conversation today and partly a conversation on Friday. Co-chairs, I want you to think about before 10 as well, whether it makes sense to try to have a longer meeting on Friday again by starting earlier. I think that's worth thinking about too. Okay, all right, so let me come back to Act 250 because I do, Judy, there's one, I know there were specific comments you actually had on invasives, and I actually want to do that next, and then we'll come back to some other ones. So there was definitely a back and forth and not agreement about incentives for kind of sort of squashing or preventing invasive species, and the question of kind of allowing things to balance and adjust as if essentially the climate changes. So we need to kind of talk about how we want to handle these, because there's a differences of opinion. So I'm curious what people think about these, and I can try to make this slide slightly bigger.
I guess I can start. I struggle with this. Well, I mean, obviously I'm an organic farmer, so pesticides, that type of management is not in my wheelhouse, and I don't support it for my own management practices. But I completely agree that nature would be absolutely fine left to her own devices and would find balance. What I'm concerned about is what I see is, I guess, the human component of how we can still manage things in and around that. I mean, multiflora, rose, other invasives are really problematic in terms of indigenous biodiversity, at least as I understand, and by indigenous, I mean native to here, but I know that that's a misnomer as well. So I'm concerned about not helping people understand thoughtful or appropriate ways to manage species that can overtake places, I guess.
Charlie.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, I think taking aside the management question, which is a big one, how do we do it? Is it chemical? Is it mechanical? Is it completely systemic changes? But as far as the management of invasives, my concern here, and I see where you're coming from, Judy. I have a hard time with the idea of whether we can find balance in all systems. One example I look at is, out in the Champlain Islands right now, we've got some pretty unique and rare forested wetland communities, which have been experiencing, these communities are dominated primarily by, ash and elm at this point in their development because of land use history and natural community. Oh, Jesus, sorry. My dogs are about to go nuts. Give me
No,
one second.
Okay. Dogs come first, no worries. Other thoughts on this one for now? Again, I think we need to figure, I think there's a.
If I could just say one thing, Patrick,
Let's do.
this is part of our religion. This is part of the coming together, the prophecies we've been given. The seventh fire, the seventh prophecy we've been given is that all things will come together, will reach a fork in the road, and one will lead us down a green pasture of diversity. The other will lead us down a burnt track of destruction. And we know through history, when this last glacier left, there wasn't any topsoil here, so there wasn't any plants. And so things have been introduced all along. Things have been changing all along as they walk north or as they walk south, whatever. They've been changing. And all I'm saying is we need to continue on that path of diversity.
Charlie and I have a question about maybe how to reword some of these, but Charlie, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize for that. We've got a bunch of stuff going outside and my dogs are making sure that we know that there's things happening. Again, my concern is around whether we can find balance in certain situations. And the example I was giving was we've got some pretty rare natural communities, specifically out in like the islands, these forest wetland communities where at this point in their successional development, they're dominated by ash and elm. And we've seen a decline in elm due to Dutch elm disease. And now we're seeing a rapid decline in ash due to emerald ash borer. And with the prevalence of buckthorn, honeysuckle, barberry moving into these stands, what we're seeing is a canopy die-off, an understory that is dominated with nothing but buckthorn, honeysuckle, barberry, which is limiting the ability of things like swamp white oak and the species that we want to see there kind of to keep and perpetuate that natural community. And so without any kind of control efforts in those areas, I'm a little afraid that those natural communities might essentially cease to exist. The soils will still be there. We could, in theory, get them back with management, but without tackling the invasive species issue, I'm concerned that we will be left with large portions of forest land, especially some that are kind of the most unique, rare, threatened, endangered, which we will just not be able to perpetuate. And so in those situations where I don't know if we can find the balance, that's where my concern of totally passive management comes in.
So are you saying, Charlie, that you can control what a natural community is and that you should control what a natural community is?
So I'm using natural community, in the definition from the work from, Bob, Liz, Eric, just kind of thinking about the natural assemblage of plants and animals that we have on our places here, given geology, soils, all that kind of stuff. And so I don't think I can control what a natural community is, but what I can kind of control is, if we know that natural community X, through the research that's been done, it leads to a state with these suite of species, given all that's involved, what I can do is I can go out and I can help kind of free up, the species that are part of that natural community from the invasives. I can underplant those species to help kind of assist migration them into the site. So I can try to promote the health of that natural community as it pertains to what we know about the composition of that natural community as it occurs outside of these species that are introduced. And so I get that like natural communities can change if we go back to glaciation and back to now. And so perhaps some of these, like forest wetland communities, maybe their future is a natural community of nothing but knotweed and honeysuckle, and that's what we're just going to accept. But I have a hard time with that, I guess.
Alyssa, then Judy. Alyssa.
Yeah, I just want to appreciate Judy sharing her perspective, and I want to respectfully disagree a little bit here. I think humans have a really important role in and are part of the ecosystem, and I think that just just saying that things shouldn't be managed at all is maybe not the best way to think about it, but to think of ourselves as part of the system. And the idea that just letting everything go will lead to balance and diversity is not, I don't think that's really true, especially if you like look at kind of how ecological systems change and flux over time. And one example that I think is really important to bring up here about while letting them go would not lead to diversity is like the knotweed in the river floodplains, you know, that they've been crowding out fiddlehead and quahash and willow and lots of other great things. And I think if we don't see ourselves as part of that ecosystem and have a role in kind of managing for balance, then we lose a lot of the diversity and the space for others.
So there's two thoughts. One is this is probably a week. John, go ahead.
Well, this may be a little crazy. I'm just wondering what this discussion has to do with climate. You know, all of these plants, whether they're invasive, introduced, or there, are sequestering carbon, which is what we're supposed to be, or controlling carbon dioxide. I'm just wondering whether we're in a rabbit hole here and trying to find the exit. I really do appreciate it. To me, it's been wonderful listening throughout the last few months to Judy's perspective, and I really have learned a lot. My biggest problem, Judy, is whether you call them invasives or introduced, many of them, like Japanese knotweed, emerald ash borer, have come here because of us. You know, they've happened overnight because of global travel, you know, all thousands of reasons. Whether controlling them or is a good thing or not, I'm just wondering, are we in a rabbit hole, and we should pull ourselves out of it and really focus on what is good for the climate. It may not be good for the ecosystem, but what is good for the climate? So that's my comment.
So there's a few possibilities in the GOV. One is I put the word appropriate, which at least modifies it. That may not be sufficient. Another possibility is we just are silent on these, or we can just note the disagreement for now in the matrix and come back to it after this week. Judy.
Yes, I'm not saying do nothing, Alyssa. In other comments, I talked about managing with fire and how fire was really our friend and we needed to use fire. That's why I've been saying all the comments should be heard and discussed, because you're missing half of the opinion here. And I'm also, there have been some chats about time, and time, it would take too long. That's the problem. People are too impatient to wait for time to happen. We can't control nature. Nature does what it wants. We can help to manage it. But for me, the purpose of discussing this is diversity. Do we want diversity?
A question about Jake, I think, had suggested added some language, which I just tossed in your kind of contingent language, which I just added to both to see if that helps. But Alyssa, then Jake.
I'm sorry, that's an old hand up. I don't need to
No problem.
take up more.
Yeah, so I suggested that edit kind of to, I think, acknowledge Judy's point here of, you know, she's kind of emphasizing that the component of diversity is the key, that we don't, you know, make, we don't assume sort of an inherent sort of bad to species that are introduced in.
Whoop, Jake,
Sorry, I just muted myself. So we don't assume an inherent, you know, sort of bad to species that aren't sort of already native here, and that, but at the same time, we need to have sort of a way in which to, you know, manage those species that do have real negative impacts on overall diversity, and that we can make those determinations with science and and sort of historical perspective. So, I feel like, yeah, making the recommendation sort of contingent on this notion of diversity is the criteria you're evaluating sort of the management by, and in turn, the management decisions you make also are attempting to enhance or maintain the overall diversity of that ecosystem. And just to John's kind of earlier point of like, what does this have to do with climate? I think this is sort of more in the realm of resilience and adaptation. How our ecosystems kind of can be in balance or bounce back, and also help us, adapt to certain types of impacts from climate change.
And Judy, I don't know whether the language added there helps with kind of addressing your point about balance and adaptation. So Judy, you want to kind of look at that language, if you can in fact read it, it's so small.
Well, to me, I don't know. I can't get my point across to you. It's about equity here. If you took every one of those plans and put a person's face on them and said, oh, I don't want you to go to seed, I'm going to pop your head off. I don't want you to spread through the root system, so I'm going to dig you up. What's the difference from that and eugenics of 1931? There is no difference.
Well, to play out, to play out that metaphor, Judy, the plants we're talking about, if there are people, will be coming into our communities and killing everybody, right? That's what's happening. These are invasive exotics that are come on a plane or a ship from Asia and are out competing our rich, diverse natural communities. We're not talking about species naturally migrating here as the climate changes, taking root and propagating. I think we should absolutely support that. That is natural progression. That's critical. And that's a sort of diversity that I think we need to be a resilient environment. But when we're talking about exotic invasives that come here and wipe out our natural plants, that's a problem. And that I don't see that as an equity issue. That's just that's destructive for biodiversity.
So let me suggest this. I think we probably, I'm going to note this, I'm leaving this yellow because it's not agreed upon, but I think we've got some potential language changes. We've got the comments here. I think we've got enough to fold into the matrix, and it may be something we need to leave in kind of explanation as we forward it. So I think to move us on, let's go forward today, but we've got some suggested changes. I don't think we're there yet. And then we need to kind of move forward. And then Alyssa, you have some language in there too that you just put in. So I'm going to fold that in somewhere too here, just as a suggestion. So, and I'll bold that. Okay. All right. So again, the yellow means we're working on it, but it needs more work. So we're not there yet. All right. Let me go back now to see. Okay. Act 250. So there was a lot of comment about the use value appraisal, about amending Act 250. There was a whole bunch of back and forth on this. So this is a complicated topic, and there was a lot of comments from you all and notes about it. So I'm not sure how we proceed with this, but it was definitely a topic with robust comment. So here's going to take a minute to look at the various comments, and then we need to figure out how do we proceed with the Act 250 question. Billy, I'm going to go to you first, and Charlie.
Okay, Charlie's hand was up first, but I'm fine going either way. So my recommendation is that there's a lot of kind of overlap and similarities with these. I think the consensus of the group that I've heard so far is that we should speak to Act 250's role in climate resilience adaptation. I put in the chat the action from line 150, I believe, of the spreadsheet, 151, excuse me, which I think is the most kind of inclusive of the various actions, duplicative actions that are currently in the spreadsheet. So that's my suggestion if we want to move ahead with including an action along these lines.
So we just kind of drop these specific ones and kind of go forward with the language from line, I think 150 that you put in the chat. Billy,
Yeah,
that's-
151, I think it is.
Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, Billy beat me to it, but I think that's also the same language on line 98 here, titled new language. And yeah, I think that kind of encompasses everything we're talking about. I might, insert a couple more commas just to kind of segment focal areas a little better. But other than, that stuff, I think that captures everything well. The other thing here is just around the idea of where we do this, whether we have one kind of lumped in Act 251 versus we split it out under things like systems and markets versus somewhere else. And I guess my advocacy would be for keeping all the Act 250 stuff together, just because as it moves, and this is getting back to kind of just more practical stuff, as those things move, we really want to see them move as a package. Because when they don't, as we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years with the forest fragmentation stuff, parts of it always get cut and left on the floor. So thanks.
So Charlie, just to be clear, so I want to be, so would 96, 97, 98 kind of go away and then it would be replaced by essentially this bolded language I put down or some version of 151?
97, I think, is a little bit different around a different issue, but I think 96 and 98, we could roll together into the language that Billy is talking about.
Okay.
I think that would capture it.
Okay. Judy, you had a question about section 148. Do you want to say more?
I'll just add, I didn't know what S148 was, Judy, but I did add as a missing, based on what you said two weeks ago or a week ago, I added in what we have as missing actions would be to support Senator Rahm's environmental justice policy, which I assume is the S148. So
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure where the things that we flagged as missing live at this moment, except I know they're in the matrix. So it is at least there. I did add it in there.
Thank you.
The environmental justice policy, is that what it is? So I name it.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
it's a bill proposal.
Great.
Pat, can I add one more piece to this conversation on Act 250? If we're focused, I don't know if we're talking about missing things right now, but I had added to the missing list of actions, something that I just put in the chat related to kind of the capacity of Act 250 to kind of address these emerging climate related issues and the likely influx of climate refugees and development pressure we will see in the coming years. So that's just a suggestion to kind of pair the substantive action around kind of updating Act 250 to deal with climate with a recommendation to revisit the kind of capacity and delivery of that program to make sure we've got the systems in place to deal with pressures in the future. So this might be something we want to talk about on Friday, since maybe folks just saw it, but I wanted to make sure we have it as part of the conversation.
So let me come back to 97, but it sounds like we'll fold 96 and 98 into some version of 150, which is getting a little messy here. We'll make sure we add about supporting the environmental justice policy, and then we'll come back maybe to look at this in the matrix on Friday. So a little bit messy, but and I'll come back to 97 in a second. Okay. All right, so 97 is the use value appraisal program. And this is suggesting a specific thing to it. And someone said that's a major change without discussion. So, and we already talked in David, I think it suggested we say something about addressing use value appraisal, but maybe not get into the details for our purposes. So probably need some discussion about this line 97 here.
Well, I guess just a couple of things. I think Charlie, it sounds like it's going to do some work looking at the use value, the current use program based on the earlier discussion to see how we can accommodate the kind of old forest, passive management, all that stuff. This is a separate piece of current use that's suggesting that that program give towns a legal right of first refusal for lands withdrawn from that program. So that's just a major change. I flagged that, whoever suggested this, I'm happy to kind of hear and understand the intent there. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. I just, it would be a major change.
Other thoughts about 97?
Could we get a little more background on it?
Yeah,
from
it's just not clear what the intent, like what
how
it's
it
trying to
works?
accomplish. Yeah.
Do you know who proposed that?
I want to say the initial discussion was that it could be modeled off of some stuff other states have done. So yeah, just some more clarity on like the process that would work, but I don't remember who floated it.
So again, I mean, one option is we leave it in the matrix for now. We just put a note to the side, the subcommittee is going to continue further discussion, and we, leave it at that for now. I'm not sure who proposed it or how we discuss it at this point. Anybody advocate?
I guess I would just say this, like, I'm not, and maybe we deal with this on Friday, but if there's not kind of general support or consensus for this, I would suggest we take it out. But if the person who proposed it is not here to speak to it, then we should hold off on making that decision.
Do we know, did that come? I mean, I know folks who's not here today. Lauren's not here today.
David's gone.
Off.
No, I'm just very late. Sorry. Hi, everyone.
Oh, it's.
Hi, Lauren. Lauren, do you know where this is modify the use value appraisal program to allow munis in the first option to purchase subdivided land? Do you know where that came from?
I have no idea.
All right, so why don't we try to figure out whether to strike it or just note it needs further discussion on Friday. I'll just note that for now. And then we've got some changes to Act 250 language that we'll clean up. We're striking some of the red, folding it into the bold here, which we can go back and look, and we're adding about support S148. Abby? Abby, did you have a comment? No, okay.
No, I was just gonna say that we should just table it because it seems pretty clear to me that the person who wrote it isn't here, and we need to figure out who that person is and what their intent was. And we can't do that if they're not here, so.
All right.
And just before we move off this slide, I guess I've got one question. I totally support the development of an environmental justice policy for the state. I just don't know if tying it to a specific piece of proposed legislation is necessary. That's a question for the group. I don't know if folks have reviewed S148, whether they agree that's the appropriate approach to take in establishing an environmental policy for the state. So I would just ask people to think about that. I certainly agree with the overarching goal, though.
Charlie.
It's
Oops,
just
right.
been proposed, Billy. It hasn't been discussed.
Right.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I'd love to take a look at it
Well,
first.
it's out there.
Yeah, no, totally, yeah.
It's just been proposed, that's all. It needs to go through all the hoops and the steps and have discussion. But basically it addresses all the environmental issues that impact people of color and how they might be fixed.
Great. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important thing that the state needs to do.
I know the cross sector is considering adding it in their component as a component on theirs. And I just thought of it because it's importance that we should as well. I don't know where it should go, but I just don't want it to be forgotten.
I think one, it may need to be elevated from where it's kind of embedded here, one, and two, maybe people can look at that. Jake put in the link to it. So on Friday, we can come back to whether we support that specific piece of legislation or we draw out the key intent and contents and then have that be this recommendation or strategy. There you go. All right, so anything else on this for now? We're gonna strike the use value one or discuss, we're first gonna discuss on Friday, figure whose it is, and we may or may not strike it. And we've got some changes to 250 that we'll incorporate into the next version.
So can I just ask one more question? Billy, Were you promoting to limit Act 250 jurisdiction to take the voice away from towns and residents?
This language talks about updating Act 250 to better combat forest fragmentation and forest loss and to incentivize growth in state designated centers. And then the one I suggested talks about revising governance and staffing so that the process has the capacity to respond to future challenges. It doesn't say specifically how to do any of that stuff. It just says that there's a need to improve the operation of these programs.
Well, there's a need to empower the voice of the public too, because I've filed Act 250 complaints and it's a bitch of a process to go through for the average person.
Yeah, I think that would certainly be part of, any improvement is to make it more accessible and navigable for the public. So, I try to be careful in these words not to kind of put any outcomes, like any specific paths or outcomes, just to put the concepts in there about increasing capacity and the functioning of the program. So certainly would welcome any edits to that. Yeah, thanks. Pat's adding public engagement, which I think is a good suggestion.
All right, got about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure they have 10 minutes for process. So this, okay, let me make this slightly smaller so you can read it. Okay, so there was a suggestion about creating a central planning office, an energy, and also these are some, so there's a central planning office question. There's also an interagency office of climate, and there was disagreement about both those things. So kind of want to note that you need to talk about the central planning and the state climate office ideas because there's not agreement.
Yeah, so I'm the one who filed these comments in opposition to these ideas. I know that there's efforts underway to create, a climate office within the Agency of Natural Resources to implement the climate action plan. From my seat within the enterprise of state government, I think that's a far more effective approach than a standalone office that would lack the capacity, technical expertise, and weight to execute the plan effectively. So I just don't think that, I don't think we need to be as prescriptive as saying, what this recommendation says. I think it's fine if we want to elevate the need to have adequate programs and staffing associated with climate. And then similarly with the central planning office, we have mechanisms for coordination across state government. I don't personally see that as a viable way to approach these issues at this time. Given my work with many state agencies that work on planning, policy, and regulatory issues. This was something that had utility in the past when we didn't have systems and capacity in all these agencies to do this work. We do now, and there's ways to coordinate that reduce the necessity for that office. It would just add another level of bureaucracy that wouldn't be additive in my view.
Alyssa, then Abby.
Yeah, Billy, I really appreciate your hearing your perspective. And I actually would be curious, folks that work in other parts of the state government besides ANR, to see how they feel about this. I think one of the reasons we thought this might be very helpful and effective is because there are pieces of the state government that might have a stake in climate change action that are not part of ANR and should maybe have a bit more personal agency in implementing pieces. I could see clearly like a lot of our recommendations would make sense to be housed by and implemented by the Agency of Agriculture. And so I think creating some clear some balanced place for things to be coordinated makes sense. If there's consensus that can happen with ANR being kind of in charge, then I would step back from this recommendation. But I wonder if there are clearly maybe some of those issues that also make sense from agencies beyond agriculture that like would have that issue as well. So
Yeah, and I'll just respond real quickly. I think the vision is absolutely for other state agencies to kind of lead and own the climate pieces that are kind of under their purview. But to have, as far as having like a central coordinating body, to have that within an agency that was resourced versus to have it be its own kind of standalone thing.
Abby, listen, do you have a follow-on, or you good?
Yeah, I also am just like not clear if there are any issues with like, you know, power and who's in control of stuff. And I'm not privy to like those things, but if there's a need for there to be a space that where no one's kind of totally in charge and calling the shots over others, that this could offer that. I don't know that there's a need, but I could see that being valuable if folks anticipated those kinds of issues.
Abby, you had your hand up.
I guess those are precisely the issues that I am anticipating being a problem. I'm not, my comment below is about the trepidation around some of this to do with, I guess, maybe the opposite perspective that Billy's bringing, is that I have seen the lack of coordination play out and how that affects the folks on the ground. And so, and the sort of politics that go into which agency matters where and who gets to trump who. And I do have concerns about how that would play out for, you know, some of how we're making decisions. We've already, it's played out in this process too. So I don't think we need, I don't think we need a new Office of Climate either necessarily. I just think that the jurisdiction over how climate issues are handled and coordinated needs to be something that has a distributed power mechanism, whether it's, you know, multiple secretaries that have a board almost, or something that talks about these things, or I'm not sure. I'm a little worried about how this is going to play out.
Right.
And fair enough. I'm just sharing my perspective. You all are certainly entitled to have your own views on this, and you know, we can reach a decision by consensus, but I'm just putting that out there as my personal view based on where I kind of sit and work in my experience.
Jane, it's a quick question. Jane, you put in the chat, PSD and AOT have been part of supporting the climate office. Just who's PSD and AOT?
Agency of Transportation and Public Service Department. And then I just wanted to remind folks that the Climate Council will be a body that always exists as well.
Yeah. Jake.
Yeah, Jane, you may have just addressed my basic question, but yeah, what might help clarify the need for this, or kind of what the structure looks like, is to know sort of how coordination is what the plan is for coordination of implementation and interagency sort of coordination and yeah, conversation. Sort of what are the mechanisms that are being proposed for that to happen, or what are they just in general? And yeah, and that might help kind of define what the actual need is.
I wonder also, because I think both these issues are tied across subcommittees, and in some ways for the council as a whole. I wonder if you all flag in the you know, in your table that, look, these are issues we've discussed, we don't necessarily have agreement on, but we do think it's important, the underlying interest in making sure there's effective, clear coordination. I think there's actually concerns both you guys have said and also in the chat about power, but maybe this is something that really is more on the lap of the council to discuss some of these institutional arrangements as you go forward. So I wonder if it's, you know, note the disagreement, but the underlying interest is clear coordination, effectiveness, freedom from political interference, et cetera. You know, and then this is really more in the Climate Council's lap than your all's.
Fine with me.
I'm going to note a few things in chat, like the one Melissa just put, as kind of underlying interest or value. Okay, Lauren.
Yeah, just a comment that beyond jurisdictional or power dynamics in this, I think something that doesn't necessarily come across here, or that I haven't heard discussed about the opportunity for an interagency office, isn't necessarily like a new new staffing need or anything. It's to bring lead regulatory and funding programmatic staff and decision makers into the same room to elevate the role that climate should be playing in each of their jurisdictions. Not only that, you know, funding and regulatory programs aren't at odds with one another, which I think is actually, that does happen within state government in Vermont and I'm sure elsewhere. So working out those kinks is certainly a value add, but I do think there are some agencies that aren't necessarily that focused on climate or don't understand the role that their agency can play in addressing the climate crisis. And I think creating a space where they are anticipated or expected to be engaged also elevates the opportunity to shift their regulatory program, their prioritization process, whatever that looks like, to actually move the climate needle within their jurisdiction. So in the absence of having that, I'm not sure how keeping climate in already climate focused agencies will help as much as this could. And maybe there's a different structure to address that need, but that's something that I consider to be a real value add in something like this.
And Lauren, I think you've nicely expressed the interest. You know, the mechanism is probably debated 8 ways to Sunday. I think you've outlined an important underlying interest. So what maybe I'm going to suggest in the matrix, we're going to have to figure out how to kind of play with this. We have to note the differences. We kind of maybe note the underlying interest, as both Alyssa and Lauren just said, and then again, encourage the council to take up some of these broader questions. Ryan.
Agency person, I don't know if I should weigh in or not, but I would just share in a parallel effort for environmental implementation, right? Water quality. There are clear sideboards set up by the legislative body that the Agency of Agriculture implements, money directly appropriated, and subject matter experts working to develop and implement the programs and policies that are outlined for the agency, which has achieved tremendous success. So while there's a distinct need for coordination, as you know, climate change touches many facets of Vermont, I do think there is efficiencies, and you know, when direction is provided by the legislature, agencies implement. And so I guess my comment is speaking to the success that has been achieved because of an agency focus on implementing land use change on the agricultural landscape. And if that's a goal for agriculture, I think there is, we don't like silos, but there is no question there is bureaucratic friction that happens when there's a transfer of funds, money, staff, time, decisions that have to be made between agencies. And so taking direction directly from the policymakers and implementing at the agency level is how I understand much of this process to work. And I think that's worked well in the water quality space, given a clear directive to implement mitigation, sequestration, adaptation, and resilience programs. I am confident the Agency of Ag could do that as well. And many of our programs already do. And we collaborate, of course, with many other agencies. So we need that collaboration, but I think the Climate Council itself was created to fill that role, is how I look at it, of coordination.
Let me just note what we haven't talked about as we kind of bring this to a close by 10. So we did talk about invasives, but didn't have full agreement. We note that. Lakes and headwaters, there were some things in there we didn't get to. River corridors, something David brought up, we didn't get to. There's mowing and pollinators. And I guess one of the questions there was whether this was or wasn't related to climate, but kind of note that there was also a new strategy suggested around chemicals that was in there. And then food systems, there were actually some new good ideas. We just haven't had a chance to discuss. I don't know that they're controversial. They were just new. There were suggestions for new ones. So let's talk about where to from here. So we've got some stuff resolved, a number of things unresolved, and some things not talked about. We want to make sure we don't lose track of any of the good notes that Marley assembled from everybody. We then have Friday to do what we can to kind of finish this thing off. So co-chairs, we have some staff help from at least Judson and Marley and Bob. I think they may need some further direction as they do that. I don't know, co-chairs, whether you need to kind of meet with them in the next day or so to kind of just think that through and then make sure we bring back to everybody here a thorough and complete effort. Well, Billy and Abby, what do you think as we go forward over the next few days?
What do you say, Abby?
First, stop laughing. First logistical comment is where are we capturing and or where and when are we bringing forward the new suggested pieces? Like, are we talking about those on Friday? Are we tabling them until after we present to the full council and coming back to them after?
Like some of the new things got folded into some of our discussion today. Some things we just haven't talked about yet. I think it would be a shame to lose them on Friday for sure. So I don't know. But there was some good stuff in the new suggestions. Judy.
What will be the reference document that goes to either the full council or the legislators? Will it be something that includes these notes that we've been talking about, these additions we've been talking about? Will it include those, or will it just be what we are talking about on the screen today?
I think for the purposes of the Climate Council, I can't speak to the later legislative piece, but the Climate Council, I think the goal is a matrix that's complete. We need to figure out what that means, but I think it's supposed to be, it's definitely, this is just only a subset for sure. This is not including everything that needs to go.
Okay.
For sure. And I think the challenge is to make sure the matrix with all the good notes you all made gets folded in. Some of the cleanup and tightening we've done gets incorporated, but nothing gets lost. So now it's just a matter of a little bit of a logistical complication, plus the idea, what do we do with the new stuff? Do we add it as line X, Y, and Z and leave it in for now and just note it's further discussion pending? That's Abby raised that important point too. And we have some staff help to try to make the best sense of it we can then by Friday.
And again, this is just our initial suite of pathway strategies and actions for the council, right? There's an understanding that there's more work to be done to revise or refine it further, to screen for equity and other priorities, and to look where there's kind of overlap with other subcommittees and reconcile those overlaps. So I think we're trying to get this as far as we can by the end of the week to get some initial feedback from the council, but we still have time to refine this further, is my understanding, after Friday.
That's great.
And Zach asked a question about public comment today too, so we should just touch base about that too. So, so I think co-chairs and the staff named, maybe, you know, Abby and Bill, I don't know if you have any time, but it may be we need a bit of a conversation among co-chairs and staff as they dive into this. I don't know whether that's doable or not, but it may be just. Abby,
while we have everybody, I don't really want to leave. I struggle when it gets left to the co-chairs, because then it I don't know what can we agree. I don't know. I guess I need clearer guidance as to what it is that Billy and I are supposed to be assembling or helping to assemble. You know, are we adding in the new comments and labeling them as such and color coding them in the matrix as like, these are things we need to be flagged, and then incorporating the comments from today?
Yes, I mean, I think, Abby, I think it's both. It's correct. And Marley and Bob and Judson may be off now. Marley, if you need direction, why don't you ask for that now?
Yes, I need direction. I ditto what Abby just said. You know, I'm happy to take the changes that were made to the slides today and incorporate them into the matrix and color code them as being new and flag the ones that we haven't talked about yet. But I do want to be very clear that I don't want to be making any decisions. I want to be coordinating and collecting.
Yeah, this is a case where having sort of a written, like what's being proposed, written in maybe the chat would be easier to process. And it sort of in conjunction with how is that leading into our Friday meeting and what we need to accomplish there. Sort of like what's the gap we need to close by end of day Friday, and then what do we still have opportunity to do as a full subcommittee? So it's just a little hard to follow kind of the tasks at hand that need to be accomplished between now and Friday morning, and then what needs to be accomplished Friday day of.
So I want to turn partly to Jane and Marion. I think the matrices that goes to the Climate Council needs to be, if it's just a sortable database of 150 things multiple ways, I don't think is going to be very usable by them. So I do think it's going to have to probably have pathway and then the strategies and actions that fall under each by tab or something. It can have as many comments and all the things that you want alongside it, I think within that fine. I just think what I'll have to take is you've now got a very thorough, rich, sortable database that needs to be cleaned up. Stuff needs to be added, stuff needs to be combined, stuff needs to be altered, as we talked about today. And then it needs to be reorganized with all the notes onto the side somehow kept, which is a little complicated as you move stuff around, so that I think you've got, a pathway per tab, like 5 or how many pathways you have those many tabs in the spreadsheet, and then you got the strategies and actions underneath each. So there's a fair amount of consolidation, adding, and sort of reorganizing to get done. Marion.
Yeah, I can jump in and I think explain at least the approach I've taken with rural resilience is acknowledging that sharing all of the actions, it's going to be a lot no matter how you organize it. I think the council acknowledges that. What I did for rural resilience was do a separate tab for each pathway. So it's a little bit easier to be able to see sort of what's grouped under each pathway. And then one tab that has all of the strategies and pathways. So folks can at least view strategies and pathways together, and then a tab for each pathway that have the actions underneath and grouped by your strategy, but it's sort of the cells are merged. So you can see all of the actions with sort of one cell for the strategy. And I think that makes it a little bit easier to see. And then I will add that Jane's going to be sending out an email later today about sort of the PowerPoint that the co-chairs can use to present to the council. I think we're thinking it'll be the same template that you all used for your previous presentation of pathways, if you all recall that one, with, pathway or strategy at the top, and then the 1 or 2 or 3 actions that you all want to highlight for each. And I think that's something you'll want to talk about on Friday, is which ones to highlight. Those actions, I think ideally should be the ones that are maybe a bit more controversial or will require a larger lift from across stakeholders. So that's something I think you'll want to focus on Friday. But I would recommend the tabs as Pat identified by pathway. I think that makes it a little bit easier to look at.
Jake, I tried to put a shortened version in the chat there. And I think one of the challenges is just mechanically doing this to track everything, not lose anything, and as it's pulled together. Judy.
Patrick, have we come to consensus on any of these, or will we do it all on Friday together?
I think there were a few from our first conversation on this we did maybe on Friday where we got green because I think it was consensus. I think yellow it's still a work in progress, so it's not consensus. And there's just stuff, as you pointed out, we haven't even talked about yet. So I think I think you all are going to have to come to consensus on Friday. This matrix is good enough to forward to the Climate Council with all the caveats you want to put on it, I think. But I don't think we're not there yet. You haven't seen the whole thing.
Yeah, and on that note, I think just in terms of organizing things, I think it will be good to identify, the things that we have a sense of consensus around, and then, kind of mark or color code the things that are still kind of, up for discussion and consensus building. And I think that would be helpful for us as well, but also for the council through this process. Because now that we've gone through some things, it is, I'm thinking like, what do we work through and come to consensus on? Like, what does that slate of things actually look like together?
And I think that's the challenge that Judy just raised, and Jake, you just clarified further, is for sure, is that putting this all together now and looking at it again is, and then having to do that all by Friday is the trick.
Yeah.
So I guess, Marley, further questions you have, given kind of the discussion we've had right now about what potentially to try to do?
No, I think Marion helped a lot in articulating how to revise the spreadsheet to keep what we have. So there will be combining of things, flagging what there is still a lack of consensus on, perhaps in one color, and then flagging what still needs discussion in another on Friday. So yeah, I can work on this today.
Okay, so Marley, Bob also offered to help, and Judson also, he's offered to help. So co-chairs, do you want to just have them work it and get as far as they can and then send it out to everybody? Or do you want to have any role between the, what the staff does and what getting it out to the full group here?
As long as the subcommittee members assembled here are comfortable with it, I'm fine not having a hand in it unless Marley, unless it's helpful to Marley for me to. It is raining today, so my options are very limited. I don't want to get a tractor stuck in 4 feet of mud, which is what would happen. So, I can help.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we all need as much time of it as possible so we can use Friday as efficiently as possible and really just focus on moving through the list as quickly as we can to kind of identify and resolve issues. So yeah, I think the more time everyone has with it, the better. I know Charlie has graciously agreed to do some drafting on some point. So I think we'll want to make sure that's incorporated into whatever goes out before it goes out. But otherwise, I don't need to see it before it goes to the full group.
I have all of today to work on this. So I'll talk with the other staff folks. I think it's going to be a challenge for multiple people to do this in one spreadsheet. So what I hope will be to get something out to all of you tonight then. So you can chew it up and spit it out and decide how we want to redo it Friday morning.
Great, thank you.
Do we want to kind of, just so people can expect, Marlene, I know you don't have Judson necessarily with you. When do you think people will be able to see this ahead of time? What's doable?
That's what I just said, by the end of today.
Okay, all right, got you. Okay, got you. All right. And so you can reach the co-chairs as you need to today. You've got Bob and Judson to help out as they offered. I will shoot you these slides in just 1 second. And then co-chairs, I encourage you to think about with Marion and Jane whether we should try to have a longer meeting on Friday. Because we only have 2 hours now, and that's not a lot of time.
Well, do we want to, is there any sense about that while we have folks here? Just can people meet at 8:30 if we need to, or do we feel like we need to? Where's the sort of general thinking on that?
I can meet at 8:30.
Billy, I see your comment that you have to.
Yeah, I got to bounce.
leave.
I think we could use as much time as we can. I can start as early as possible. So leave it up to you all to figure out if we do change the time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Billy. We have people put in the chat if they can't meet earlier. That's helpful. And I think we started at 8. Abby, we started at 8:30 like last time, so maybe we shoot for that.
I think we did, yeah. And that works on my end as well if needs to.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so John can, Lauren can, Alyssa, can you meet earlier on Friday?
Alyssa can at 9:30.
Judy?
I can meet a little bit earlier. I have another meeting I can't miss, but I'll come when I can. You should get started for sure.
Judy, are you available to meet earlier on Friday morning if we started at 8:30?
I am, but I have a conflict at 11, so I'd have to leave by 11.
Okay. So one thing to note, if
Jake
people,
can. Go ahead.
so
Bob.
looks like we're good for 8:30.
I think so, yes.
And
Also, when we get done with this, Zach did make the point that there wasn't time for public comment. So if everybody can stay on, or whomever can stay on a little bit longer to get public comment in at the end of this, that would be good. Thanks.
all right, so 8:30. Thank you, staff, for churning through this matrix. People take a look at it tomorrow. We'll try to find a way to be thorough in getting through this by Friday, as you all noted, to kind of reach some consensus. Again, to forward it to the Vermont Climate Council, it's by no means done. And Abby, I know I have to jump off, but thank you all for the hard work, and we'll keep at it. Abby, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks. All right. Let's open it up to public comment. Zach says, prefer to have time at the outset of the next meeting rather than now. Okay. You have time now. So I mean, if you want to add public comment, please feel free. If you choose not to at this moment, that's your choice as well. But I believe we've all indicated we can stay on the line if folks have things they would like to add. Zach?
Abby, do you want me to go? I wasn't sure if that was silence while you were waiting or not.
Yeah, you're the only person with your hand up, so
that's great. I'm just looking for your cue. No, I mean, honestly, I don't think it's really fair to anybody. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's me or anybody else to kind of try to squeeze this in at 10:10 when you all need to be other places, and kind of like a room for absorption for the day is kind of over. So I appreciate the chance to speak now, but it just seems like meaningful public comment has to happen in a slightly different manner. And so I guess this just, yeah, this doesn't seem quite right to me. But I appreciate the chance to just jump in for a second. You know, with a minute or so here, I'm not really sure how much I can even offer, but I did want to start by just saying that I attended the first in-person public facing you know, Climate Council hosted meeting last evening in Elmore. Marion and Jane and the whole crew did a fantastic job. It was an excellent event. You all, you know, if you were involved, thank you for helping to make that happen. And so just really want to give a shout out to all of you for the amount of time and energy that you're putting into this, because it's a lot. And I know that, you all families just like I do, and other lives outside of this. So thank you. I wanted to just, you know, maybe take a second to say that, you know, Jake had some great points today about the need for specificity and making sure that, you know, we aren't just kind of stopping at the goal and kind of strategy level with a lot of these recommendations. Like it seems to me we are right now. There were some suggestions today to kind of keep things more general, and I can see the kind of inclination to want to do that and kind of maybe not get into the nitty gritty, because it's just hard to put forward specific recommendations. But you know, this climate action plan is a generational moment. You know, it's no small task. I don't need to tell you that, but it's also no small opportunity. And we have to rise to this moment and put forward some really aggressive actions in this document. Otherwise, what's the point? Why have we been involved in this for so many months? If we don't get to that level of specificity, calling for the action sensible, I don't know why we're here. So I hope that we'll, you know, make sure that in those final actions that we're really making some concrete suggestions for how to move forward, and not just letting other people debate this down the road, because that's what will happen. Is we'll make a general recommendation and we'll have to hash this out all over again in another venue. And you all have the privilege here of making a really specific recommendation that the agencies need to act on, or the legislature needs to act on. Don't lose out on that opportunity. You have a tremendous amount of power afforded to all of you, and I hope you'll use it. That's, you know, that's my hope. You know, I've shared again today information on the myths of substituting wood products and biomass for electricity. I hope that you'll all keep following the science. And I also want to, you know, just say how much I appreciate Judy's comments today about humility and not entering into this with hubris. You know, there are so many examples of where, you know, stepping back would be actually the best course of action, and that's another, you know, area where I hope this you know, group will you know, really kind of think far-sighted, many generations ahead in terms of what we're leaving for the future. yeah, I think I'll just leave it there because it's been another long meeting, and I'm at the very end here. And I do appreciate the chance to comment. I didn't mean to be rude by saying that I would hold my comment until the next meeting. I just, I know how swamped we all are, and how, we've all got things to get to after this. So that's why I suggested that. Anyways, thank you.
Thanks, Zach. I know you weren't coming from a disrespectful place in that. I appreciate your thought in that regard. The one piece I would add to I think you're right. I think this is a generational moment. I think we have a lot of privilege here. I also think that is a bit, we were placed in an artificial setting with a deadline that we did not choose. And so our ability, like part of coming to inspirational, generational wisdom and thinking deeply about how we move forward in a transformative way requires time. We don't have time. That was not imposed by us. And so I would encourage any folks that are feeling like this really is a once in a generation moment, where you're feeling like you want us to get more into specifics and things like that, that you provide some comment to the legislature regarding their timeline in this regard. We're all working in situations where we have full-time jobs, and we're coming to this table to try to do the work as best as we can. And to reach consensus takes a lot of time. To move at the speed of trust takes a lot of time. The law says we're supposed to be doing this in a just transition, but it doesn't give us the time to do that. And so that is a massive issue here. And I guess it's difficult to feel the weight of that only on us when, we're trying to work within the constraints under which we were given. Thanks. Nope, I muted myself. Mark Whitworth, it looks like you have a comment you'd like to add.
Yes, thanks, Abby. I'm sorry that my camera isn't working, which means that it's okay that I didn't bother to comb my hair. I want to, in my opinion, I've gone to visited some with some other subcommittees in addition to this one, and the work that you're doing is the most important of any of the committees. If, in the opinion of many people, the loss of biodiversity is the real crisis, and climate change is going to accelerate that. And if we are to have policies in Vermont that recognize the importance of preserving biodiversity, you guys are going to be the ones to do it. And I think we're all counting on you to do that. I've been meeting with individual legislators over the course of the summer and discussing biodiversity. And they, I haven't talked to one who would not be receptive to a proposal to make changes to the Global Warming Solutions Act to elevate the importance of the preservation of biodiversity. But it's got to come, it's going to be much more effective if it comes from you rather than some guy that lives in the Northeast Kingdom. So, you're doing really important work, and there's a lot of people that are counting on you. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Mark. I have heard in some other areas as well that the feeling that maybe we need to elevate some more language around biodiversity. So it's in the back of my mind at the moment. Maybe we can address that a little bit better on Friday in terms of, where maybe we're missing some language around that. I know David Mears has raised that as well. So certainly I think I can speak for the group that we are all on board for the preservation and elevation of biodiversity, and its immense importance. So thank you for your comment. Is there anybody else that wanted to add anything today for public comment? Annette?
Yeah, along those lines, one idea is in terms of Act 250 to add a criterion for ecosystem services. And this is supported by the Commission on Act 250, who held all these public meetings, and they asked everybody to rate the various things. And so there's a record of all of this. And in almost every single public meeting, ecosystems were at the top of everyone's list. There were a couple of meetings where it was sort of tied with an economics, but it was surprising to me how many people were in supportive in terms of what is the single most important thing in Vermont, and that was ecosystems. So that is something that may be brought to the legislature elsewhere, but it's something to consider, that you look at the work of the Commission on Act 250. If you can find the reports out of the various public meetings that were held, that's where you'll find the information about how Vermonters sitting around a room in breakout sessions rated the various aspects of our state.
That's really interesting and super helpful. I do not know where that report lives, but I can certainly try to look into that. And I think you're right that any approach we can take where we're collating work that's been done in other places, particularly if it involved public engagement and the perspectives of Vermonters, as you said, around a table, is really things we want to be elevating. So I will try to follow up and find
it for you too.
something on that. Thank you so much. Was there anybody else that wanted to add public comment today? Sorry for the dog tag noises in the back. All right. Oh, Scott.
Hi, everyone. This is Scott from CLF. I really appreciate the excellent work that the subcommittee is doing, and I just have a few brief thoughts. First, I wanted to follow up on last week's discussion about whether Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions inventory protocol established under 10 VSA 582 allows for net emissions accounting for ag and forestry. And I guess I wanted to say that I don't think it does. Section 552, which applies to Section 582, defines emission as a release into the outdoor atmosphere of air contaminants. And that definition only seems to encompass the release of GHGs and not sequestration. And nor does Section 582 discuss sequestration, only emissions. So I think that the result is that the GHG inventory protocol can only account for GHGs released or gross emissions. And my second thought is that this only amplifies the critical role that Vermont's farmers are already playing and will play in solving Vermont's climate challenges. I think the GWSA is aiming for an 80% gross emissions reduction by 2050, and also a net zero emissions by 2050. And I think getting from 80% gross reductions to 100% net reductions will require sequestration. And as the subcommittee has discussed, farmers are already demonstrating that they're equal to that task. So I guess rather than advanced GHG accounting changes that would upend the GWSA's framework, and that I also think go a little bit more to the Science and Data Subcommittee's responsibilities, I think that this subcommittee should advance climate recommendations that support farmers' ingenuity and that ensure that farmers thrive. Things like payments for ecosystem services, credit unions, access to alternative and local markets, tailored financial products and insurance products, technical assistance, and all sorts of other creative solutions. Great. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Scott. We'll continue to tack away at that. I'm not sure what the resolution is going to be on all of that at the moment, but I appreciate your perspective on that. Was there anybody else that had anything to add? All right, everybody. I see no hands at the moment, so I think I'm going to call it. Really appreciate everybody's time and willingness to both have a meeting aside from our normal time, and also, for staying over. I know that I guess I just feel like I need to say that I know what this is taking for everybody to show up and do this work, and I really appreciate that you all continue to come and do it in spite of the difficult nature of it. So we will see you all on Friday.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you.